A locked hotel room. A dead man's trunks wheeled out under armed guard. That man is Nikola Tesla, and this is how his story actually ends. Not the inventor, not the myth, the seizure. Room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, January 1943. Tesla had been dead for at least a day, maybe two, before anyone found him. He died broke, mostly forgotten by the public that once packed lecture halls to watch him hold lightning in his bare hands. Within hours, before his own family had even been properly notified, men from a wartime federal office were already standing in that room, going through his belongings. Here's what should stop you cold. The agency that showed up was called the Office of Alien Property. Its entire job was to seize the assets of foreign nationals living in the United States during wartime, people whose home countries were now enemies of America. Tesla wasn't one of those people. He had been a naturalized United States citizen since 1891, more than 50 years before he died. On paper, that office had no business anywhere near his belongings. They took everything anyway. Trunks, filing cabinets, decades of notebooks went out the door under guard that same day, and a large portion of it has never been fully accounted for since. To understand why a dead man's private papers were worth violating federal jurisdiction over, you have to go back almost 40 years to a stretch of farmland on the North Shore of Long Island, where Tesla built something that, for a few short years, made some of the most powerful men in the country very nervous. To get there, you have to know who Tesla already was by the time he broke ground at Shoreham, because the reputation he'd built by 1901 is exactly what made a man like Morgan willing to write a check in the first place. A decade earlier, Tesla had been the losing side turned winning side of one of the ugliest corporate wars in American history, the so-called War of the Currents. Thomas Edison had built an empire on direct current, and he fought Tesla's alternating current system with everything he had, including a public campaign designed specifically to make AC look lethal, funding demonstrations where animals were electrocuted with alternating current to frighten the public and lawmakers alike. Tesla won anyway. His system, licensed through the industrialist George Westinghouse, powered the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, and just a few years later, Tesla's AC technology was chosen to harness Niagara Falls itself, sending electricity to the city of Buffalo across a distance that direct current simply couldn't reach. By the turn of the century, the entire direction of the world's electrical grid had bent around one man's idea, a matter of settled engineering history, not legend. Tesla wasn't some fringe eccentric chasing government money on a whim when he approached Morgan. He was, at that moment, arguably the most credible electrical mind alive. And just before Wardenclyffe, there was Colorado Springs, a chapter of Tesla's career that's every bit as strange as anything attributed to that midnight test on Long Island. Except this one, he documented himself, in his own hand, in a private journal that still exists and has been studied by historians. In 1899, Tesla set up an experimental station in the thin mountain air outside Colorado Springs, chasing the same core obsession that would later define Wardenclyffe: the idea that the Earth itself could carry electrical energy like a conductor. What he recorded there reads like something out of fiction. He claimed to have generated artificial lightning bolts up to 135 feet long, loud enough to be heard from 15 miles away. He claimed, in letters and later interviews, to have wirelessly lit a bank of light bulbs planted in the ground, roughly 25 miles from his lab, with no wire connecting them to anything. The equipment he built there dwarfed anything else operating in the region at the time, and his experiments pulled so much current from the local grid that he reportedly overloaded and damaged the generator at the El Paso Electric Company's plant, briefly knocking out power to the entire city of Colorado Springs. And then there was the signal. Late one night at that mountain station, Tesla recorded picking up something in his equipment he hadn't been looking for, a strange, rhythmic electrical pulse, repeating with a regularity he couldn't explain away as noise. He became convinced, and said so publicly, that he might be listening to an intelligent transmission from another planet, and he speculated openly that the source was Mars. It made headlines. It also, quietly, made people start to wonder whether the man behind alternating current had started to lose the thread. Mainstream physicists at the time and since have generally concluded he was most likely picking up natural atmospheric interference, or possibly stray signals from other experimental wireless stations. Tesla, for his part, never fully let go of the idea for the rest of his life. Whatever the full truth behind everything he recorded there, Colorado Springs is where Tesla walked away convinced, for certain, that the Earth could be turned into a global conductor of electrical energy. Wardenclyffe was his attempt to prove it at a scale the whole world could see. The place he chose was called Shoreham, a quiet patch of Long Island that had never had a reason to appear on any map that mattered. And then, starting in 1901, it did. Rising out of the flat fields was a structure that looked like nothing else built in America up to that point. A tower nearly 200 feet tall, a skeletal wooden frame topped with a massive metal dome, less like a building and more like something that had been dropped there from somewhere else entirely. Locals called it Wardenclyffe, and most of them had no real idea what it was for. Neither, in a sense, did the man who was paying for it. That man was John Pierpont Morgan, the closest thing America had to a private central bank, a financier whose signature alone could steady a national panic. Tesla had gone to him with a pitch that, on the surface, sounded almost modest for a man of Tesla's reputation. A tower for wireless telegraphy, messages sent through the air, no wires, no cables strung across oceans. In an age when a message from New York to London still depended on undersea copper lines that cost fortunes to lay and maintain, that alone was worth backing. Morgan wrote the check. What Tesla didn't spell out quite so plainly was the second half of the plan, the half that mattered more to him. He didn't just want to send messages through the air. He wanted to send power, real, usable electricity, transmitted without wires, potentially to anywhere on the planet, for the cost of building a receiver. Picture that for a second, because it's worth sitting with. A world where electricity wasn't metered, billed, and delivered through a private company's wires, but simply available, the way sunlight is available, to anyone who built the right kind of antenna. It's the kind of idea that sounds like a fantasy today. In 1901, to the one man on Earth who had already tamed alternating current, it looked like an engineering problem, not a fantasy. The theory, as Tesla explained it in his own writings and lectures, hinged on something he called the resonance of the Earth itself. The idea that the planet behaved like a giant, slightly imperfect capacitor, capable of carrying an electrical charge if you excited it at exactly the right frequency. Tune a tower to that frequency, and, in principle, you could pump energy into the ground on Long Island and pull it back out anywhere else on the planet. No wire required. Whether that theory would have actually worked at any meaningful scale is something serious historians and engineers still argue about today, and here's the detail almost nobody mentions. There is no verified record, anywhere, of Tesla ever successfully demonstrating long-range wireless power transmission. Not once. Everything that came next was built on a theory he never got the chance to prove, which makes what happened next even harder to explain. Tesla brought in Stanford Watt, already one of the most celebrated architects in the country, to design the facility, and the two men picked Shoreham for one specific reason. It sat close enough to the Atlantic that a transatlantic signal seemed technically plausible. Morgan's initial investment, roughly $150,000 worth many millions today, wasn't charity. In exchange, Tesla signed over a majority stake in the patent rights. Morgan was buying a communications company. He had no idea, or so the record suggests, that he was about to fund an attempt to give the world free electricity. Construction crawled forward through 1901 and into 1902 and 1903, and money, as it always does, became the story's quiet villain. Costs ran over, the tower's footprint grew, and in the background something happened that would matter more to Tesla's future than any technical setback ever could. In December 1901, a rival Tesla barely had time to compete with. An Italian engineer named Guglielmo Marconi successfully sent a wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean from Cornwall in England to Newfoundland in Canada. It wasn't power transmission, and it wasn't even particularly sophisticated compared to what Tesla was attempting. But it didn't need to be. Marconi had done the one thing Tesla hadn't done yet. He'd made it work, publicly, and gotten there first with basic wireless communication. For J.P. Morgan, a man who measured investments in returns, not visions, that changed the calculation overnight. The original pitch, wireless telegraphy, had just been effectively scooped by a competitor with a far cheaper setup. Morgan's enthusiasm cooled fast, and so did his checkbook. Letters between the two men from this period, which do survive and have been examined by historians, show Tesla pleading for more funds and hinting, cautiously, at the tower's grander purpose, the transmission of power itself. Morgan wasn't interested in funding a planet-sized free electricity network. If anything, a man whose fortune was tied to industry, infrastructure, and metered utilities had every reason not to be interested in one. By 1904, the money had effectively stopped. Construction on Wardenclyffe halted with the tower still incomplete, the dome never finished to its full plan specification, the transmitter never brought to the operating power Tesla believed he needed. This is the part where the legend and the documented history start to pull apart from each other, and it's worth being honest with you about which is which. The legend, and it has circulated for decades in various forms, involves a single test run late one night, sometime in 1903, conducted in secret before the funding fully dried up. In the version of the story that's been passed around, Tesla brought the tower to full power just once, with almost no witnesses present, and the results were extraordinary and alarming in equal measure. A visible arc of electricity tearing into the night sky, lamps in distant, unconnected buildings supposedly glowing to life on their own, telegraph equipment for miles around allegedly going haywire, unmarked men watching silently from beyond the property fence and vanishing before morning. It's a genuinely gripping story, and I want to be straight with you about something. There is no verified documentation, no contemporary newspaper account, no surviving instrument log, and no corroborating witness statement on public record that confirms this specific event happened exactly this way. It appears to trace back to second-hand recollections and stories that circulated well after the fact, sometimes attributed to unnamed assistants or associates who supposedly worked alongside Tesla during this period. That doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened that night. It means we simply don't have the kind of evidence that would let anyone tell you, with confidence, exactly what did. What we do have confirmed from Tesla's own writings, patents, and the physical remains of the site itself is enough to make the story remarkable without needing to borrow from folklore. Tesla was, without exaggeration, one of the most important electrical engineers who ever lived. His work on alternating current didn't just contribute to the modern electrical grid, it essentially became the modern electrical grid, still the dominant system used to transmit power across the world today. A man with that track record building a 200-foot experimental tower specifically designed to test wireless power transmission, and having the single most powerful banker in America personally bankroll it, and then abruptly pull out, all of that is documented, verifiable, and honestly stranger than most fiction. So why did Morgan really walk away? The official explanation, the one that fits neatly into a story about a business deal gone sour, is straightforward. Marconi beat Tesla to a workable, cheaper version of the original pitch, the costs kept ballooning, and Morgan simply cut his losses, the way any investor eventually does on a project that stopped delivering. That explanation is almost certainly the largest part of the truth. But it leaves a smaller, stubborn question sitting underneath it that historians still chew on. If the tower's only real purpose was wireless telegraphy, a service Marconi had already delivered more cheaply, why did Tesla keep fighting for funding specifically to increase the tower's power output, well past the point where simple message transmission would have required it? His own letters from the period reference wanting to scale the system up, not scale it down to match a competitor's cheaper solution. That detail doesn't prove some grand suppression. It's entirely consistent with an inventor chasing an idea larger than what his investor had agreed to pay for. But it's also the seed that, over the following century, grew into every version of the story you've ever heard about what Tesla was really building out there and why powerful people supposedly wanted it stopped. With Morgan gone, Tesla tried and failed for years to find replacement funding. He wrote to other financiers. He wrote to Morgan again more than once, each letter a little more desperate than the last. None of it worked. Wardenclyffe sat abandoned, its wooden frame slowly weathering on that Long Island farmland, a 200-foot monument to an idea nobody would pay to finish. In 1917, more than a decade after construction had stopped entirely, the tower was finally demolished. The official reason given at the time, during the First World War, was a wartime security concern, a claim that German submarines might somehow use the structure as a navigational landmark along the coast, though there was never any concrete evidence supporting that specific fear. What's documented, without dispute, is more mundane and honestly sadder. Tesla owed money on the property, and the tower's scrap metal alone was worth enough to help settle part of the debt. It wasn't seized by shadowy government agents in this instance. It was torn down for salvage value, like countless failed structures before and since, and the demolition crew that dismantled it was simply doing a paid job, not executing a cover-up. Tesla lived another 26 years after Wardenclyffe fell, and those years were not kind to him. He drifted between hotels, sometimes unable to pay his bills, developing an increasingly public reputation for unusual behavior that historians and biographers still debate the causes of. Everything from severe obsessive-compulsive tendencies to the simple, grinding effects of watching your life's greatest ambition dismantled for scrap. Friends and hotel staff who knew him in these years described rituals that bordered on the obsessive, an insistence on staying in rooms whose numbers were divisible by 3, a compulsion to calculate the volume of his soup or coffee before he would touch it, an aversion to touching anything round or to shaking hands, all of it documented in multiple independent biographies rather than invented after the fact. He also, by numerous well-corroborated accounts, developed a deep attachment to the pigeons of New York City, feeding them daily in the parks near whichever hotel he was living in at the time and, according to people who knew him, forming what he himself described as a profound personal bond with one particular white pigeon he claimed to care for above almost anything else in his life. Whether you read that as the tender detail of a lonely genius or the sign of a mind slowly coming apart at the edges, and reasonable people land on both sides of that question, it's one of the few pieces of Tesla's late life that isn't seriously disputed by historians. He kept working, kept inventing, kept lecturing to increasingly smaller and skeptical crowds, even as the newspapers that once treated him as a celebrity scientist began treating him more as a curiosity, an old man in a hotel room making ever grander claims that the general public had less and less patience to take seriously. And, near the end of his life, he made a claim that, unlike Wardenclyffe's midnight test, does have real documentation behind it, even if the claim itself was never proven to actually function. In 1934, Tesla announced to the press that he had designed a weapon capable of ending war altogether, a device the newspapers eagerly nicknamed the Death Ray, though Tesla himself called it Teleforce. According to his own public statements and the surviving technical descriptions he circulated to several governments, He described it in interviews as a stream of microscopic tungsten pellets, accelerated to tremendous velocity by a specially designed open-ended vacuum tube of his own invention. A design detail specific enough that it reads less like pure showmanship and more like a man who genuinely believed he had solved the engineering problem, even if he never had the funding to prove it at full scale. Tesla insisted, repeatedly and consistently, across multiple interviews over nearly a decade, that he had conceived it as a defensive weapon, one so devastating that no nation would dare start a war it could actually win, a kind of invisible wall any country could raise around its own borders. He reportedly offered detailed proposals to the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia in the years leading up to his death, hoping one of them would fund a working prototype. The Soviet approach is the best documented of the group. Correspondence and later Soviet-era accounts indicate that Tesla was in contact with Amtorg, the Soviet trading corporation operating in the United States, and that a payment, reportedly a modest one by the standards of a weapons program, was made toward research on the concept in the late 1930s, though there is no verified evidence a working device was ever completed or tested on Soviet soil either. None of the governments he approached produced a functioning Teleforce weapon, at least none that has ever been publicly confirmed, and no verified working model was ever built or demonstrated during Tesla's lifetime. Whether the underlying physics would have actually worked at the scale he described remains, to this day, an open and genuinely disputed question among historians of science, not a settled fact in either direction. Some physicists who've examined his surviving descriptions argue the core concept, a charged particle beam sustained over open air across hundreds of miles, runs into fundamental problems with atmospheric interference that Tesla's writings never adequately address. Others point out that elements of the underlying idea, focused particle beams and directed energy, would eventually become real, functioning areas of physics and defense research decades later, long after Tesla was gone. Which finally brings us back to that hotel room in January 1943, and the seizure that, unlike almost everything else in this story, is not folklore. It's federal record. Tesla was found dead by a hotel maid, alone, having explicitly asked not to be disturbed for several days beforehand, which is part of why the exact date of his death is still listed as an estimate rather than a certainty. Within a remarkably short window afterward, agents from the Office of Alien Property arrived and took custody of his effects, including notebooks, correspondence, and technical papers spanning decades of work. The justification given at the time for the agency's involvement, despite Tesla's confirmed American citizenship, was reportedly tied to wartime concerns about his more advanced and unpublished research, including material related to Teleforce, potentially falling into the wrong hands during an active global war. That's a real legal gray area historians still write about, because citizenship should have placed his estate outside that office's normal authority, and the exact legal reasoning used to justify the seizure has never been fully, satisfyingly explained in any document released since. An engineer named John G. Trump, a professor at MIT and, notably, the uncle of a future American president, was brought in shortly afterward to review the seized papers on behalf of the government. Trump held a reserve commission with the National Defense Research Committee at the time, which is the official reason he was chosen for the assignment, and he spent roughly 3 days going through the material in a government warehouse before filing his report. Trump's assessment, which is part of the declassified public record today, concluded that Tesla's papers, so far as he examined them, contained no evidence of any new, usable scientific principle or discovery, describing much of the material as speculative, theoretical, and in places essentially incoherent by that point in Tesla's declining life. That report has often been cited as proof the government found nothing worth hiding, but it leaves its own uncomfortable gap. If a credentialed reviewer concluded there was genuinely nothing of value in those papers, why did substantial portions of Tesla's files remain classified and inaccessible to the public and to his own family for years, and, in some cases, decades afterward, only gradually released in fragments through subsequent Freedom of Information requests filed by researchers and journalists starting in the 1980s? Some material connected to his later work has still never been fully accounted for in any public archive. It's also worth knowing that Trump's review wasn't the only federal interest in Tesla during this period. FBI files on Tesla, later released under the Freedom of Information Act, confirm that the Bureau was separately tracking rumors and public claims about his death ray research going back to at least the 1930s, years before he died, treating the possibility that a foreign power might obtain the plans as a legitimate, if fairly low priority, concern. Those same files show internal correspondence, running well into the years after his death, about whether any of Tesla's remaining associates or family members abroad might still have access to unpublished technical material, correspondence that continued long after Trump had already filed his report saying there was nothing of value left to find. That's confirmed by the documents themselves, not speculation. What those same files don't do is resolve the central mystery. They record that the government was worried about what Tesla might have built. They don't record, anywhere in what's been released, a clear final answer to whether he actually built it. There is one more documented thread in this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it complicates the tidy version of events even further. Tesla's nephew, a Yugoslav diplomat named Sava Kosanovic, arrived at the hotel in the immediate aftermath of his uncle's death and, by his own later account, found that a portion of Tesla's most personal papers, along with a black notebook Tesla was known to have kept, had already been removed from his belongings before Kosanovic ever got access to them. Kosanovic spent years afterward petitioning the United States government to recover what remained of his uncle's estate, and, eventually, a significant portion of Tesla's surviving papers, along with his ashes, were released and transferred to Belgrade, where they remain today, housed in the Nikola Tesla Museum. That museum, remarkably, still holds thousands of original documents, including technical drawings and personal correspondence, that researchers can request access to, and it remains one of the few places in the world where anyone can go and examine a meaningful slice of Tesla's actual working notes firsthand, rather than relying on second-hand summaries filtered through decades of retelling. But even the museum's own archivists have acknowledged over the years that gaps exist in the collection, stretches of Tesla's later correspondence and technical notes that were referenced in his own writings or in other people's letters to him, yet were never recovered, never transferred, and have simply never resurfaced anywhere, in Belgrade or in any American archive that's been made public. None of that proves a conspiracy. It's entirely possible, maybe even likely, that a wartime bureaucracy simply moved slowly, misfiled things, lost things, or classified material out of excessive caution rather than any deliberate cover-up. Governments are frequently sloppy in ways that look sinister only in hindsight. But it's also fair, and honestly necessary, to say the official explanation doesn't fully close every gap either, and that's exactly why this story has had the staying power it's had for more than 80 years now. Not because every wild claim about death rays and free energy for the masses is true. Most of them almost certainly aren't, or at least can't be verified with what's publicly available today. But because the small number of things that are documented, a naturalized citizen's estate seized by an agency with no clear jurisdiction to seize it, a tower built specifically to test a theory about free wireless power that was abruptly and permanently defunded, a self-described peace weapon that multiple governments were quietly interested enough in to request detailed proposals for, are strange enough entirely on their own, without a single invented detail added on top. If you're the kind of person who finds it more unsettling when the truth is messy and incomplete than when it's cleanly wrapped up in a bow, this channel is probably going to become a habit. So consider subscribing now, because the further into Tesla's later, stranger years we go, the harder these questions get to answer cleanly. So where does that actually leave you, with all the myth stripped back to what can be verified? It leaves you with a man who genuinely reshaped how electricity moves through the modern world, who built a 200-foot tower on Long Island chasing an idea about wireless power that was never proven to work and never proven to be impossible either, because it was never finished. It leaves you with one of history's most powerful bankers pulling his money the moment a competitor delivered something cheaper and more immediately profitable. A decision that looks perfectly rational on paper and conveniently sinister in hindsight, depending entirely on which parts of the story you choose to emphasize. And it leaves you with a dead man's papers, taken by an agency that had no clear legal right to take them, reviewed by an MIT professor who found nothing remarkable in them, and still, somehow, kept out of public view for years afterward with no fully satisfying explanation for why. Maybe that's just what bureaucracy looks like when it's tired and at war and doesn't want to be blamed later for having let something slip through. Or maybe there's a version of this story none of us have the documents to tell yet, sitting in a file somewhere that's never been declassified or was quietly lost decades ago in a filing cabinet nobody thought to protect. What makes Tesla's story different from so many other tales of suppressed genius is that you don't actually need the unverified parts to feel unsettled by it. Strip away the midnight test, strip away the men at the fence, and you're still left with a naturalized American citizen whose life's papers were seized by an agency with no clear legal standing to seize them, a financier who funded a tower to test free wireless power and abandoned it the moment a cheaper alternative appeared, and a man once ranked among the greatest engineers alive who died broke in a single hotel room with almost nobody left who remembered how much of the modern electrical world had started, quietly, with him. A tower torn down for scrap, papers scattered across 2 continents, a weapon that may or may not have ever worked, offered to 4 governments who all, apparently, said no. Every serious historian who's spent real time with this material, working from the same scattered, incomplete archive the rest of us are stuck piecing together, agrees on the unglamorous part. Tesla was a genuine genius whose reputation and finances collapsed together at the end of his life. What none of them agree on is whether that collapse was simply the ordinary, unfair way the world treats brilliant people who run out of money at the wrong moment, or whether somewhere in that seized collection of notebooks there was ever anything that actually justified the secrecy that followed. Nobody alive today can settle that either way. The people who could explain it are gone, and the paperwork that might have explained it for them was never fully allowed to see daylight. What do you think actually happened to the parts of Tesla's work that never resurfaced? Bureaucratic carelessness, wartime caution, or something someone genuinely didn't want the rest of us to see? Tell me where you land in the comments. I read all of them,